Hi, my name's Lou Eisen. I'm a boxing writer and historian, and today we're lucky to have on the show, it's a privilege, Mr. Murray Greig, who is Canada's best ever sports writer, but also Canada's premier boxing writer and historian ever. And if you want to know anything about boxing, you speak to him. I just wanted to let you know that he's written many books. So we would be here for a couple hours if I was to name all of them. By the way, I keep getting pinged as I'm speaking because the Jays choked tonight and lost. Murray is the author of 6 books for Canadian and U.S. publishers, and of course, and I have them. So he's written Chuvalo, A Fighter's Life. This is a must-have for any Canadian sports fan, boxing fan, and Canadian. And he's also written my Bible, Going the Distance, which is the premier history, the best ever written about the history of Canada's greatest fighters, of all of Canada's fighters. He's also published The Complete Idiot's Guide, and I am a complete idiot, so that was for me, to the biggest deals in hockey history, and The Complete Idiot's Guide to Boomer TV, Penguin Books, New York, 1999-2000, Trail on Ice, A Century of Hockey, that's from Trail BC, and the Home of Champions, and also Big Bucks and Blue Pucks, from Hall to Gretzky, an anecdotal history of the late great World Hockey Association. I went to many games there, and author of way more than 500 byline features for every North American and Asian periodical you know of, including the Hockey News, TV Guide, Ring Magazine, Sports Collectors Digest, the Hockey Research Journal, Asia Sports Review. Anyone, anywhere wanting to find out something about hockey and the history going back 150 years and boxing going back more than that, Murray Greig's the guy you're going to call because he's got it all. He worked for the China Daily, 203 to 205, and also 212 to 220. He was the Alberta writer in residence in 208, and is also part of an initiative jointly administered by the Library Association of Alberta and the Alberta Writers Guild. And he was contracted by the Northern Light System to serve as a writer in residence for 12 Northeast Alberta communities. And he's also written for Sun Media. 1984 to 202, he was Canada and the world's premier boxing writer. 205 to 212, he was the senior copy editor and staff writer, Edmonton Sun. And he covered pro and amateur boxing, hockey, and auto racing. He also wrote nationally for syndicated daily TV columns and for syndicated weekly boxing columns. He is simply, he's the Muhammad Ali of Canadian boxing writing and hockey writing. There isn't anyone better than him. He's the gold standard against which everyone else is measured. Please welcome to the show, Mr. Murray Greig.
Wow. My mom couldn't have done a better job.
You're probably thinking, wait a minute, I didn't know I wrote for all these places. I think they owe me money still.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a privilege and a pleasure to have you on. We had a great talk last night, and I could talk to you and pick your brain for the next 30 years about boxing. I love your books. Going the Distance should be required reading for everyone from grade 1 on, because these are true heroes of our nation. They help build the nation.
Well, I wrote that in 96, and I had the idea of sort of running around my mind for a few years, but it always bothered me that everybody knows our sports heroes are all hockey players, right? And with few exceptions, we got Steve Nash in basketball, we got a couple of ball players, we got Gilles Villeneuve, but you look at guys like George Dixon and Sam Langford and Lou Briard and Georges LeBlanc, all these guys that had marvelous ring careers, and in a lot of ways were true pioneers of the sport. I mean, George Dixon basically invented shadow boxing.
Mm-hmm.
He invented the speed bag.
Yes.
He was the most famous black man on the planet and the first black champion in boxing history, but nobody knows about him.
No.
And so it always kind of bothered me that this stuff was lost to history. So when I was doing Going the Distance, it was a pleasure to go back and research these guys and try and try and weave a narrative that would bring their exploits back to life for a lot of most Canadians that had never heard of them.
You went even farther than that. I said I sent something to Canada Post, but you did it long before I did, and much more eloquently. You sent a file on George Dixon and other fighters saying that this is part of our Canadian heritage. They helped build this nation, and there needs to be recognition of this. It should be on stamps.
Absolutely. And we as Canadians, we have a national inferiority complex to begin with. And we just, for whatever reason, there's resistance to recognizing guys that and men and women that maybe weren't mainstream famous, as it were, and whose exploits are lost at time. But when I did that, I wrote a proposal. I went through my MP years ago to get in touch with the officials at Canada Post, and I proposed that they do a 6-stamp feature on Canadian fighters. And it was received very positively. I had some very positive feedback. I did profiles on several fighters that they would consider, that I hope they would consider. But we went back and forth for about 6 months, and they seemed really enthusiastic about it. And then that was it. They dropped it. No explanation, no rhyme or reason.
That's not forgivable, and it's not like you're coming out of the ether. You're a world-renowned boxing writer, So people from all over the world and other Canadians come to you to find out about these people. You know what you're talking about. It's inconceivable that they. You wrote it out for them. You did their job.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting you should bring that up, because when Going the Distance came out, it did very well. But the vast majority of the letters and the feedback that I got was from readers in the U.S. and Europe. Wow. I mean, I got some from Canada, but the overwhelming majority was from the U.S. and Europe and Australia.
It's interesting you say that. I was working on a book about George Dixon, and Jason Winders beat me to it. And a friend of mine in England, Tony G, is a bare knuckle boxing writer and historian, Tony. And so he sent me articles about Dixon that were written in Australia and New Zealand, and people, but Canadians should know that he was a world-renowned figure. This was a black man who was loved everywhere and respected for his talent.
Exactly. He would, and at that time, particularly in England, there was still a very rigidly enforced social strata as far as, the races were. But in England, he was treated like royalty. In Australia, he was treated like royalty. New Zealand, he was treated like royalty. In the US, he was mobbed everywhere he went, in a good way. But Canadians, nothing.
It's unbelievable. When I was doing research on him 7 or 8 years ago, I called someone in Nova Scotia in their archives, and the person said, "Why would there be any info on him? No black people have done anything in Nova Scotia of any worth." And I thought, I wish I'd taped that.
Yeah, exactly.
And the same goes for Sam Langford, who's the greatest fighter to never win a world title.
Exactly. And yet you mentioned Sam Langford to 1,000 Canadians, and 999 of them are going to go, who?
And interestingly, he would have beaten Ketchel again had Ketchel not been murdered. I wanted to talk to you about this. So he fights Ketchel, and Ketchel agrees to fight him again.
That's right.
And Ketchel, and I was reading a friend of yours, a friend of mine, Arnie Lang's book on the Dixon fight with Terry McGovern.
Right.
And how much of an outlier is, how odd is it that McGovern and Ketchel weren't bigots? So many fighters are racist then, but these two guys, they had no problem with each other. They
had no problem with it. I think number one, I think that was just in them. And number two, they were very savvy businessmen, both of them. And they both knew that, this was a meal ticket. Ketchel's whole career was was built around controversial fights that he would either look just good enough to win and get a rematch immediately for more dollars, or he'd fight black fighters that nobody else wanted to touch because he knew that it was a sure way to get not only headlines but a lot more bucks.
Right. And Langford, if Ketchel hadn't died, Langford gets that title shot.
Absolutely. And the whole thing was that Langford. I mean, Jack Johnson wanted nothing to do with Langford. I mean, they did fight once long before, but Johnson was very adamant that he wanted nothing to do with Langford, and that reputation went all the way up to Jack Dempsey. I mean, Jack Dempsey wrote in his own autobiography, the one guy that he feared that he flat out wouldn't fight was Sam Langford.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I mentioned this to Randy Roberts, whom and so many other writers, them all. It must drive you crazy when you see revisionist history online or in some articles.
Yeah.
And you think, even with George Chuvalo, you think, I was there at that fight. So
exactly.
Yes.
But it's, but that's symptomatic of what's happening across all areas of research and writing in general. Nowadays, if somebody can't go on Google or go on the internet and find an answer on Wikipedia in 15 seconds, they just dismiss it. Oh, it didn't happen. It's not on Wikipedia. Or it's
right.
And the days of writers going back like you have and I have and a lot of these other guys have, where you go back to the original sources. And to me, and I'm sure you'll agree, the greatest single source for a researcher, especially in sports research, is the daily newspapers, the daily press, because that's as it happened. And that's the single best record because it's immediate. It's immediate. I've done a lot of research and I'm just working on a book right now about the McCarty-Pelkey fight in Calgary for the World White Heavyweight Championship.
That's famous.
1913, yeah. But again, the records of that are totally lost except for the original newspaper accounts. And that to me is a priceless source. But sadly, as the newspaper industry continues to die a long, slow death, those resources are going to be gone forever. So I thank heaven that we've still got historical research being done on the internet by people that are dedicated enough to go back and look at the original sources instead of just this piecemeal selection of the flavor of the week and what can we put together that makes sense that is going to be good enough.
It's heartbreaking because newspapers brought down Richard Nixon and other corrupt governments. They're the ones that keep people honest in sports and everywhere. Yep. And without them, we lose our biggest policeman.
That's right. And now, I mean, what passes for journalism today is really just regurgitation. It's retweet. Yeah. Who cares? Who cares about some anonymous tweeter or Twitter guy that wants to react to a story? I mean, the days of having people on the scene that actually probe and investigate and dig and do the grunt work, they're sadly gone. But back in the day in boxing, as you well know, was the number one attraction in newspapers for half a century.
Yes.
Front page stories all the time. But it's a sad commentary on our society in general that the days of probing and digging and investigating are gone.
Yeah, they don't cover newspapers, especially in Toronto, don't cover boxing anymore.
No,
and the Sun, which you work for, was the only one in the whole country.
Yeah.
Steve Buffrey here, your friend, and you were the only two.
Yeah.
You were one of him, and you were the only guys.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's and I remember back in the day. I mean, you look, 1986 when Willie DeWitt and Ken Lacusta sold out Northlands Coliseum in Edmonton for the Canadian title fight. I mean, 15,000 people. That was unheard of at the time, and there was well over 200 requests for media credentials.
Wow.
And yet 2 years later, when DeWitt finally called it a day on his career with his final fight against Henry Tillman, the Olympic rematch fight, there was me, Buffery, and I think two other guys.
That's sad.
Yeah.
That shouldn't happen. You know what I think is wonderful about you doing the Arthur Pelkey, Luther McCarty book? It's a great story, but you're the only one who can write it.
Thank you.
You're the only one of the talent and the skill, but also the knowledge, not only of what it meant to boxing, what it meant to the province of Alberta, and what it meant to Canada, and to the boxing community around the world at that time.
Well, absolutely, because it was a benchmark event, because the fact that McCarty was killed in the first minute of the first round, opened up a whole new level of debate on whether prize fighting should be altogether banned in Canada. It was in Alberta for several years, and what it meant to society to have this kind of spectacle, and its ramifications went far beyond that May 24th weekend in 1913, and the racial overtones, for having a white heavyweight championship, that continued right up until basically the 60s, when there were, I mean, as recently as 1985, I think it was, when you had Dwayne Bobbitt and Kali Konitsa in South Africa and having it billed as the World White Heavyweight Championship.
Yeah.
So,
here's something I wanted to ask you. So, at the International Boxing Hall of Fame, and you've been there a million times, and I was lucky enough to be there with you and George.
Right.
And I got in a bit of, I should say, trouble, but I was sitting around for a group of people, these other writers and historians, and they mentioned, we're talking about the lineage, and they said, well, starts of John O'Sullivan. And I said, I consider him to be the first white heavyweight champion, because he didn't fight George Godfrey.
That's right.
And he didn't fight Peter Jackson. So how can you say he was the best heavyweight in the world?
Exactly. And that's, but that's part and parcel with the whole idea that, you couldn't be a true world champion unless you were a white guy. and in Sullivan's case, I mean, that was the start of the quote unquote modern era of the heavyweight championship, but it goes back 200 years before that.
Yeah.
Guys like Tom Mulligan and Jackson and these guys, but they're basically lost to history.
Yeah, I've read books on Molyneux, and also I can see his face, the guy that trained him, the other black fighter.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so you read about it, and it's just heartbreaking, what they go through, and how Molyneux, is cheated because, I mean, this Cribb gets knocked down, and everyone's saying, hey, he bit him, he had a foul, and they're arguing for 30 minutes, at which point they go, oh, okay, well, he's awake now anyways, let's just fight.
Exactly. And then you go during Jack Johnson's reign, after he defeated Tommy Burns, and Johnson actually kind of pulled a reverse color line.
Right.
He wouldn't fight any fellow black fighters, because you look at a guy like Joe Jeanette, who had to fight Langford 18 times. And Joe Jeanette in any other era would have been a heavyweight champion of the world.
Yeah.
As Langford would have.
And I mean, you look at Langford beat Joe Gans. Langford was trained by George Budge Byers, and Tommy Ryan, as you know, wouldn't fight him.
That's right. Yeah.
And everyone
Yeah.
said, well, wait a minute, you can't call Ryan a racist. He fought black fighters. He didn't fight elite black fighters like George Byers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Byers and Godfrey are two success stories. This is something that Canadians need to know. I mean, Godfrey retired for a lot of money, and his family grew it because they wouldn't sell the land that he bought.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And Canadians have no clue.
Well, it's just, I was talking to a fellow the other day, and we were talking about Jack Johnson, and he said it's strange that Johnson didn't fight any Canadians. I said, well, there was a guy named Sandy Ferguson from Nova Scotia who fought Johnson 7 times,
Wow.
7 times, and got 2 draws with him. But he was one of the white go-to opponents for Jack, who had to stay busy. But Ferguson had a pretty decent career. But again, it's just been lost to history because nobody knows about it. Nobody cares about it, even in Nova Scotia.
No, and Johnson is such an interesting character. I mean, he definitely. Joe Woodman's, Langford's manager, said years later that he definitely beat Langford. He said, Langford, I wrote stuff of the opposite just to save Sam's confidence. But he said this was Sam's 18th or 20th pro fight, and this was like the 85th fight for Johnson. But he could see how well, as you said, Langford became. But didn't Johnson agree with the National Sporting Club that if he beat Burns, he fights Langford there, and he broke the contract?
That's right. And he ended up sailing when he left Australia. They made a stop in Honolulu and then went to Victoria. Mm-hmm. And in Victoria, he's the new heavyweight champion of the world. And he and his entourage get off the boat in Victoria, go to the Empress Hotel, which is still the queen of hotels in Victoria, right in the Inner Harbor. And they wouldn't give him a room. They told him his wife was free to stay there because she was white, but him and his sparring partners, everybody else, had to find other accommodation. And the same thing happened 2 nights later in Vancouver. So he ended up making, in some sources it's called a title defense, and others it's called a 6-round exhibition. But he ended up in Vancouver just 3 months after beating Burns. He made his first appearance as champion in the ring against Victor McLaughlin, who was an Irish guy from Spokane, Washington, who had worked as a police officer in Winnipeg, moved down to Spokane to do some boxing, came back up to Vancouver, fought Johnson, got absolutely beaten to a pulp, but realized that had the good sense to realize his limitations, became a movie actor down in Hollywood, and ended up winning an Academy Award for The Intruder. Yeah.
Well, this is the question I meant to ask you before. I want to ask you before I forget. So Tommy Burns had a wife named Jewel. And I read different things, So I asked Adam Pollock, who wrote a book on him, and other authors. I said, I heard Jewel was the sister of a black sparring partner. I heard Jewel was black. And Adam said, we don't know. He said, there's so many different reports.
Yeah, that's true. That's been kicked around for a lot of years. And Burns always avoided it. He never talked about it one way or the other. Right. But there's a lot of evidence to indicate that she was part black. Yeah.
I think Burns was ahead of his time in the sense that people were outraged that he asked for $30,000 to fight Johnson, but he said he's the best one. If I need to take that risk, I should get the most money.
Exactly. And he was, people forget that Tommy was always self-managed. Yeah. He negotiated all his own deals. He signed his own sparring partners. He took care of all his arrangements, and he was a brilliant businessman. And he knew going in. I mean, Johnson had chased him all around the world, but again, Burns was the first legitimate world champion because he beat the best from everybody else. He beat the American champion, he beat the British champion, the French champion, South African champion, the Australian champion, and Johnson was on his tail the whole time. And Tommy finally thought, well, let's get it on. But if we're gonna, I got to get the lion's share of the dough.
Right. Which still goes on today.
Yeah.
And, I asked Bert Sugar, I said, people always demean Tommy Burns. And he said, they didn't during his time. They only did after he fought Johnson. He said, these were bigots who spread lies about him.
That's right.
He wasn't a good fighter. He said, Burns was actually a great fighter. So he said, people compare him and Willard, but he said, I don't think Willard would have gone 2 rounds with Tommy Burns, despite the height difference. I think Burns would have destroyed him as bad as Dempsey. He said, but because he had the gall to say to these racist former champions, I'm going to give this man a chance, they were like, well, then the media and everyone attacked him.
Exactly. And you look at a guy like Jack London, the famous novelist, White Fang and Call of the Wild. He was the correspondent for the New York Herald at ringside in Rushcutters Bay when Johnson and Burns fought. And you read his account of the fight, and it's like, what were you watching? How this pipsqueak from Canada had no chance at all and was beaten to a pile of mush by the giant Ethiopian. And in fact, if you watch the film, I mean, Burns, he lost the fight, but he got in his licks and he was still on his feet when it ended. And he never, because of the racism and because of the reaction, of white people to the fact that, like you mentioned, he stood up and said, no, this guy deserves a chance. People never forgave him for that, and for the rest of his life.
That's exactly what Bert Sugar said.
Yeah,
and and you mentioned this to me at the Hall of Fame years ago. But that they still dislike him because of it, and it's revisionist history.
Exactly, and now of course and it gains legs, through the decades. So now you bring up the name Tommy Burns. Oh, he was a bum. He was just a little guy. He had no business being champion, which is totally wrong.
Yeah,
because he beat everybody. He beat everybody.
Chris Dundee told me one time. He said, "You've heard this before, son, but it implies it's not the size of the dog in the fight; it's the size of the fight in the dog."
Exactly.
And he said Tommy Burns at that time was the toughest man on the face of the earth, and he would have taken on anyone, anytime, and he did.
He did.
And he did, yeah. And he was smart. He went to Johnson's body. That's what you do with a taller guy.
Yeah. And he was beside the fact that he was, like I said, he was the first true world champion, and that he left North America and went to Europe, went to Australia, fought everybody. Everybody that came calling. He was an innovative fighter. He for a little guy, he had unusually long arms, but for a little guy, he mastered the art of pivoting to get maximum leverage on his punches. And if you watch the films of him, I mean, he was a real slick puncher, especially, like you said, to the body. And that was the only chance he had against Johnson. And early on in the fight, I mean, he more than held his own.
Yes, and what I love about Burns in the Bill Squires fight and other fights that you've seen a million times is when the bell rings, he's circling. He's watching what the guy's going to do.
Exactly.
He's letting the guy throw punches, and he's going, okay, so he's going to lunge, he's going to do this, and then he moves in and takes the guy out.
Yeah. He was a very cerebral fighter.
Yeah, a great man. And once again, other than the book by Mr. McCaffrey, who I've been trying to contact for years, and the stuff you've written, he'd be lost to the ages.
That's right. And it's kind of sad. I mean, the story, but he was buried. He died in Vancouver.
Broke.
Broke, and he was buried in an unmarked grave. And it wasn't until years later that Cyclo Taylor and some other hockey players and lacrosse players that Tommy had been friends with got together and got a nice headstone. And you can go today to Ocean View Cemetery in Burnaby, BC, and it's it's very simple, but it's striking, and it's sad that there's not more recognition of that.
Should be a Tommy Burns Day.
Absolutely, yeah.
We have Robbie Burns.
Yeah,
someone like Tommy Burns.
Yeah.
This was a great man. Cyclone Taylor had an interesting comment. They asked him about the racist things he said to Johnson. He held up his hand. He said he got caught up in the hoopla, but if you knew Tommy, he wasn't like that. And I saw him. I saw him in a mixed company. He said I saw him with black people and white people. He wasn't like that.
That's right.
He just got caught up in what was going on at that time in Australia.
Yeah, and he was, he like we mentioned before, he was a good businessman too. He knew what buttons to push to sell more tickets, to get more hype.
He also was the only one that ever apologized to Johnson for saying stuff like
that. Absolutely. Yeah.
And Johnson was really taken by that. Mm-hmm. And Johnson himself said he was a great fighter.
He did, yes, on more than one occasion.
Yeah, so, if Jack Johnson, the greatest defensive fighter ever, says that, I mean, who else are you going to believe?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So absolutely. One of the other things I wanted to, there's, I could name a million fighters that and we could go for a year, but I loved the George Chuvalo book. It was very evocative. But it was also touching. I was extremely sad when it ended. I didn't want it to end. And there were times when I laughed out loud, like with Cleveland Williams talking about getting punched in the balls. and that was hysterical in the men's room. But also times, talking about George's family, where I was really, really crying. It was just, he's such an inescapably Canadian figure and so much a part of the history of our country. It was like he was pulled directly from the Canadian Shield.
Exactly. I don't think, other than maybe Gordie Howe, I don't think there's another Canadian athlete that comes close to representing the true spirit of Canada and the resilience and the determination, on a national level than George does. And I'll tell you in 2017, when I was working in China, me and my girlfriend decided to take a little holiday to North Korea. And
wow,
it's a complicated process to get a visa for a Canadian to go to North Korea, and you have to leave from China. But I was already living in China. So when we made the application, hers was approved right away because she's a Chinese citizen. But for me, it took several months. And one of the hangups for applying for a visa is that you have to tell them who you're working for in China, what your employer is. But they don't allow journalists in unless they're invited. So to get around that, I was working for China Daily, so we couldn't very well tell them that I was a journalist. So my girlfriend said, well, we'll put on the application you're an author, for Canadian and American publishers. You write books, and we'll see if that. So sure enough, we fired it in, and they came back and said, yeah, we'll approve the visa, but when you get to Pyongyang, you're going to have to show us a book with Mr. Greig's name on it, so we know he's a real author. So the Chuvalo book had only come out a few months before that, and the publisher was good enough to send a dozen copies to me in Beijing. So I thought, well, I'll just take one of those. So we get to Pyongyang International Airport, and they only call it that because there's a flight from Vladivostok every day and a flight from Beijing every day. Other than that, it's an ultra-modern 21st century spectacular looking airport that's totally empty. So we're standing in line at customs, and all of a sudden 3 guys in uniform come up, and I'm the only white guy in this group of Chinese tourists. And they're looking for the author, right? So my girlfriend tells them that, we've got the book, and they whisk us into this little office. And obviously they don't speak English or read English, but they speak Chinese. So they asked my girlfriend for the book. She hands it to them. And there's three guys. One of them's, old like us. And the other two are fairly young guys, but they're all in, official uniforms. And they take the book and they make a big deal about flipping through it to make sure there's nothing, offensive, especially the pictures. So they're flipping through and they get to the pictures, and all of a sudden the old guy looks up with a big smile on his face and he points to the picture. He goes, Ali, Ali. And my girlfriend tells him in Chinese, yes, his friend fought Muhammad Ali 2 times. And the guy goes, Ali, Ali. And he's going like this, right? So that was it. They stamp it and we're good to go. Yeah.
That's a fantastic story. That's a book in itself. I mean, that should be that has to be an article in Maclean's or some magazine. That's a wonderful story.
Well, it was great, and it was fantastic because everywhere that when I was working in China, I was there on and off for a total of almost 10 years, and I got to travel all over Asia covering events, and everywhere I went, I ran into boxing fans, and the name of Muhammad Ali was just magic, and I was pleasantly shocked, stunned in some cases. That to find Chinese and Filipino and Japanese and South Korean fans that knew all about George too. So
yeah, at the Hall of Fame I saw, and you saw this because you were right with them. People from Australia, South Africa, Norway would come up and say, George Chuvalo.
Yeah,
I've known you since and they never met him, but you came up since I was a kid.
Yeah.
You mean the world to me.
Yeah.
He was always polite, especially with kids.
Oh.
When he would sign the autographs there. I mean, you saw it. They would climb on his lap and hug him.
Oh yeah. It was it's you have to see it to believe it. Yeah.
I remember going in when we went in I think it was for one night at the Rusty Nail Tavern there or something for dinner. George was the last one in because he's signing an autograph. Autographs, and on the hot Saturday, as you saw, I said this when I came back to people. Canadians have to be there to see hundreds and hundreds of people lining up to get his autograph and photograph. And he took time to talk to everyone.
It's just I was so lucky to spend so much time with him, in Canastota and other places. But the reaction was always the same, whether we were in Florida, New York, Minnesota, LA, Seattle. It was mind-boggling how popular he was. And yet the same thing would happen in Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Regina. But in Toronto, not so much.
No, he never got his. We talked about his.
Never got his due.
No, he was treated horrifically by the local newspapers.
Oh, guys like Milton L. and Jim Coleman.
Yeah,
who
idiots.
Just totally moronic.
And attacking him, not for his ring skills, just as a person.
Yeah.
He doesn't do this. He doesn't that. He should this. And that's nothing to do with boxing. What they were talking.
Yeah.
And I think that, as we mentioned last night, Merv McKenzie should have actually had to fight Mike Tyson for what he did to George.
Yes.
Not allowing the Ali fight to be called the world title fight. Everywhere else on this earth.
Everywhere else on the planet,
yeah. Except here. And what did George say to you about that?
Oh, he to this day. I mean, it really bothered him that, if he had won that fight, he would have been heavyweight champion everywhere in the world except his hometown, because McKenzie, and all his ilk on the commission were so locked in with the WBA that they said, no, we can't sanction this as a world title fight. And it broke George's heart. And today, you look at the program even from that fight, which is very, a rare artifact in itself. But it's Muhammad Ali, the people's champion, versus George Chuvalo, heavyweight showdown.
That's unbelievable. And when people would complain about Ken Hayashi, and for good reason, the boxing former Ontario Athletic Commissioner, I would say you can say what you want, but he was Einstein compared to Merv McKenzie.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
And we mentioned I think it was the Roy McNeely fight in Toronto where people showed up and the Gardens was locked because he hadn't okayed the printing. He forgot to okay the printing of tickets.
Right.
Forgot to name referees for the fights. Forgot to have doctors there, judges.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a terrible commissioner. And we mentioned how in Sports Illustrated he used the N-word when describing how he part of WBA contingent. And so does so many other people.
Oh, exactly. And and it's interesting because if you go back and you look at the U.S. press coverage, particularly around that fight, and even newspaper guys from the U.S., from New York, Dave Anderson, one of them more vocal, really chastised the Toronto press, the Toronto media, and the Toronto Commission for how absurd it was that the way they treated George.
Yeah.
And these were Americans, coming in from Florida and Chicago and Miami and Detroit, saying, what are you guys, a bunch of little tin gods,
I don't know if it was Anderson or Robert Lipsyte. It may have been you would know better than me, but when Terrell came and he had Bernie Glickman, the mob killer, in his corner.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the New York writers wrote, I guess I didn't go to school long enough. I guess in Canada, if you work for the mafia and you murder people, they allow you in.
Yeah. I think that was Lipsyte. Yeah.
He said this is a well-known mob figure that has murdered people on the orders of Tony Accardo, and Canadian Customs said, yeah, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Come on in. Yeah.
And the way he threatened Irv and other people, and
sure. Yeah.
And I never. You won't remember. You may not remember this, but I remember what you told me. You told me when I was with you at the Hall of Fame. You said, watch the Terrell Chuvalo fight and count the fouls. Count how many times Ernie fouled him.
Yeah.
And you said to me, when you get to 100, you'll probably stop counting. And unbelievable.
Yeah.
Thumbing, which is the most egregious of all the fouls.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Headbutting, elbowing.
Yeah.
Wiping the laces, stepping on the foot.
Yeah.
Over and over. And then
over and over again.
And Terrell had the gall to call Ali a dirty fighter.
When he was
the dirtiest fighter in
the sport. Not so much as one warning.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, unbelievable. And George turned to the ref and said, he's thumbing me. And George never complained.
That's right.
You hit me low, it happens. I'll hit you low back. Yeah. But you don't thumb a guy. You're taking away his career.
Exactly. Yeah.
How long have you known George for? When did you first meet George?
I first met him in person on June the 12th, 1986, which was 3 days before the first DeWitt-Lacusta fight in Edmonton. And George was, at the time, training and managing Razor Ruddock. And Ruddock was the number 2 ranked contender behind Lacusta for DeWitt's, or behind DeWitt for Lacusta's title. So they were coming in as guests of Willie DeWitt Enterprises to, hype the next fight, because everybody, had decided that DeWitt was going to win. They didn't count on Kenny giving him a good fight, which he did. But so I still remember they booked, the promoters had booked a room for George and Razor at the Edmonton Inn. So they were supposed to get in about 9:00 at night. So I went out there. I went out to the hotel about 8:00 and sat in the bar for a couple hours, and no show. So finally, about 11:30, the lobby's almost empty, and the bar's winding down. I think it was a Thursday night, and in comes through the front door. George comes through and Razor, and they got nobody else with them, and they got their bags and everything. And I walked over and I introduced myself, and because I talked to George a couple of days before on the phone, and said that, I'd like to sit down with him and Razor and do a real in-depth thing on Razor. And he said, oh yeah, that'd be great. So I introduced myself, and he said, oh, thank God. He said, it's been a long day, long flight, and all they gave us on the plane was peanuts. so it's almost midnight. So I said, well, we still got time. We can get something to eat if you want. He said, oh yeah, I'm starving. Razor wanted to go to sleep. So Razor goes up to the room. Me and George go out to a restaurant that I knew in Edmonton that was still going to be open. We sat until 3:00 in the morning, just talking. And finally, the restaurant owner asked us to go, but only after George had signed menus and napkins for all the staff. But I drove them back to the hotel and made arrangements to meet them the next afternoon for lunch and the interview. And when I showed up the next day, Razor was very standoffish.
That's the way he is. Yeah.
And he, to be honest, he wasn't a scintillating subject to interview.
That's true.
But George, never drops the ball. You just sort of ask him and then try and stay with him. And we just hit it off right away. And after the fight, it looked like it was going to be Willie's first title defense was going to be against Razor. It never happened. But after the fight, George said, we're going to stay in touch, and, whatever's happening with Razor, I want you to be the first one to know, blah, blah, blah. And after that, we used to talk, we initially were talking 2-3 times a week. And then, subsequently, for different assignments, I'd be in Toronto or he'd be coming out west, and we'd always hook up. And, about a year later, he was no longer with Ruddock, but he was coming out to Edmonton for a special promotion for a jewelry store. And he said, I don't know where they got me staying. And I said, well, why don't you just stay in my place? My wife and my son at the time was like 3. So he ended up staying. He was supposed to stay for 2 days. He ended up staying for a week, which was just fantastic.
Wow.
And that's when we first started, when I first broached the subject of writing a book, with him one day. And he says, he said, a lot of people have asked me about that. He says, I don't know when the time's right. He said, we'll talk about it. And so I didn't push him on it for years, but we always stayed close. And in 1989, I was training and managing Danny Stonewalker, the Canadian light heavyweight champion. Yeah. And when he became the first Indigenous Canadian and the first Albertan to fight for a world championship when he fought Michael Moore in Pittsburgh for the WBO light heavyweight title. And so as soon as we got that fight, I phoned George right away and said, you got to come to Pittsburgh and work the corner with me. So that was great. He without hesitation, he agreed, and he came down to Pittsburgh. We had a great time. We ended up staying there for about a week after the fight. And we got along so well in the corner that he said, he was working with Jimmy Gradson and a few other fighters in Toronto. He said, when I got fights out west for these guys, he says, we'll be hooking up again in the corner. So that was wow. That was great. So we ended up working probably a dozen or 15, 16 fights together. And
that's a book in itself. That's a fantastic story.
Yeah, he was great. Yeah.
You've been exceptionally close with him for a very long time. I don't know of anyone closer than you.
Well, it's to me, it's almost unbelievable, because he was
like family.
He was my, other than, I had 2 heroes, 2 sports heroes when I was, just a young kid. One was Frank Mahovlich, and the other was George, 2 Croatians.
Oh, wow.
and I remember distinctly when I became a Chuvalo fan. It was January of 1964 when he fought Zora Foley on the Friday Night Fights. Mm-hmm. And I remember being mesmerized when Don Dunphy was doing the introduction, ahead of the fight. and he was talking, about this young Canadian kid, Canadian champion, who was a throwback to Rocky Marciano, and great things were expected of him, and he was still pretty inexperienced at the time, and Zora Foley was one of the real slick, old, savvy veterans in the heavyweight division at the time. They fought in Cleveland. Foley won the 10-round decision. But I remember thinking, how cool it was that this was a Canadian that I could identify with. And the crowd just went nuts over him. And Dunphy in his commentary said, I remember he said, you watch George Chuvalo, he'll never take a step backwards. And that resonated with me. And sure enough, it was, it was sort of the beginning of my hero worship of him, I guess. And then to get a chance to not only meet him professionally, but to become, very close personally and do the book with him was, to me, it's still unbelievable,
I always thought, but you would know better than me. I always thought Doug Jones was his best fight because Ungerman didn't want him to fight Jones.
Yeah.
And George said, I'm going to destroy him.
That's right. Jones was ranked number 4 in the world at the time. And, he lost a very close decision to Cassius Clay at the time. But he was a slick fighter and very popular in New York. And, George knew it, and against everybody, against everybody's, recommendation, he took the fight, and he ended up knocking out Jones in the 11th round, and it was until the Corey fight, I'd say it was his best victory.
Yeah, because he I don't think he carried Jones, but I think he wanted to prove something to Ungerman because he kept battering Jones, and I thought, just knock him out already. But it was like to Irv that you're full of it.
Yeah, and and of course afterwards, Ungerman was, we knew we had it right from the start. I was, but that was Irv.
Yeah, and Jones was never the same again.
No.
My favorite picture of the Hall of Fame is the one of George walking to his corner, looking over his shoulder, and there's Jones in flight, falling face first to the canvas.
Yeah. Classic. Yeah.
And I mean, the Patterson fight, Angelo Dundee said, Patterson's a former champion. He's from New York. They're not going to give it to George. Even if George had knocked him out, they're not going to. Exactly. And, Patterson was the guy that collapsed in his shower right after the fight. Right.
And Dave Anderson from the New York Times was the only one who mentioned that. The Toronto media guys, Chuvalo was in over his head, blah, blah, blah. Anderson, you go back and read his stories in the New York Times about that fight, you'd think it was a totally different fight that he was watching.
And George said he didn't want to go fit. He wouldn't sign. Patterson wouldn't sign
That's right.
15 rounds, right?
That's right. And he wanted no part of a rematch. Yeah.
Because if it goes one more round, Patterson doesn't make it out.
At the end of the 10th, Patterson walks to the wrong corner. He had no idea where he was. Yeah.
I asked George, did it bother you that Zach Clayton said Chevalier?
Chevalier.
And he said, to be honest, I wasn't even listening to him.
That's right.
I was just looking at Floyd thinking, I'm going to destroy you.
Yeah. Zach had a talent for butchering names.
Yeah. And I mean, he beat Patterson because, as he saw, Patterson himself was never the same, collapsed and went to the hospital.
That's right. Yeah.
And those were body punches.
Yep. Oh, no heavyweight in the 60s hit to the body like George. Nobody. No. Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah.
The only one I could compare to George as a body puncher would be Tony Zale, the middleweight.
Yeah.
That would be it. But no one in heavyweight.
Good comparison. Yeah.
And you mentioned Jerry Corey. Corey said before the Chuvalo fight, no one's ever laid me out for 10.
That's right.
And George just caught him with that shot and bang.
Yeah.
How many times did he go down from that punch? Twice or 3 times?
Twice. He went down, got up, went down again, and then when he was on his knee and he got counted out, and of course he went wild after that. But Zach gave him every opportunity. It was a slow count. And George had the great line afterwards. Well, because Corey had said, well, I didn't understand the count. and George said, well, if you don't understand 9 from 10, then it must have been a pretty good punch. and
that's fantastic.
And Mike Corey, who was at ringside, he went to George's dressing room afterwards and said, there's no way Jerry was going to get up. So, yeah.
It's funny because at the Hall of Fame one year, somebody was mentioning that, and Angela looked at the guy and said, Corey's knees were on the ground when the referee said 10. That's a knockout.
Yeah.
End of story.
Yep, exactly.
Doesn't matter who you cheer for or where you're from.
Yeah.
The rules don't change.
That's right.
You mentioned Mike. This is off topic, but I thought Bob Foster killed him when he knocked him out.
Yeah.
Because he didn't move for a good 10, 15 minutes.
Oh yeah, and then there was that little twitch in his foot, like Johansson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when you mentioned that if he doesn't know 9 from 10, we were talking last night about George had such a great sense of humor, calling Muhammad cautious Clay, and then when he first met him, his arms were so skinny. He said, "Hey, Popeye."
Hey, Popeye.
Yeah.
Popeye, yeah. No, he's he's very glib and very, very funny, and it's from Angelo, George was never shy about expressing his opinion in a humorous way when it came to opponents. He was never mean spirited, but he had a way of phrasing things that made it very memorable. When he fought Calvin, can't think of his last name, in Hull, Quebec, Calvin Butler in Hull, Quebec in, I think it was 68. And he knocked him out in 3 rounds, but the Canadian press reporter asked him afterwards, it looked like you were taking your time. And George said, well, punching him was like, punching a bowl of pudding because, he had a pretty thick girth, but he said, when you're enjoying pudding, you want to take your time. So
that's very funny. Yeah, he made me laugh a lot of times. There was a guy named Richard Koletsky who has this big shrine to Ali, and I think he might have written a small something to go with it. So he said, I met George. I mean, as you know, George is at every day. He's met so many people. How can you remember the millions of people you met?
Yeah.
But this guy said something, and it was in Yiddish. And George said, I showed him the email. And he said, I don't remember. I said, really? I understand the Yiddish.
Yeah.
I just don't remember the guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he told me the story once that in the 50s, late 50s. I told you this last night. So my uncle, Dr. David Eisen, gave him his first physical for his first professional fight. And at his office on, I think it was Spadina or whatever. And the room was full of like 20 women, patients. And when George walked out in his underwear, he was like an Adonis. He steps on the scale and the women swooned. They all swooned because they couldn't believe how gorgeous he was.
Yeah.
And he was the big, bright hope of all boxing.
Absolutely, yeah.
This was a well-spoken, educated, gorgeous guy that was going to change the world.
Yep. And like he says, in retrospect, if he had made the decision earlier to train full-time in the U.S., to live and train full time, preferably in Florida. Who knows what might happen. He ended up moving to Detroit for a couple of years.
Right.
And that's where he first hooked up with Teddy McWhorter, who became his go-to trainer. But he never, by staying in Toronto, and he did it because of his family. By staying in Toronto, he sacrificed the opportunity to have real good sparring all the time, and also to be in an environment where he could train full time without having to deal with everything else. He, as you well know, he's such a people person. He loves to have people around, and by living and training in Toronto, he always had his friends around. He always had obligations, on top of the family stuff. So it was, that took a toll. And at the peak of his career, just getting ahead of the Ali fight, the first Ali fight, right through until 71 or 72. If he had the opportunity, or if he had forced the opportunity to go south, things might have been considerably different for him.
Well, as you know, Charlie Goldman loved him.
Yeah.
And Goldman trained Marciano and Marty Servo. And he was the one in New York who said, you're throwing your punches out the window, shorten them up, throw it from the hip.
Yeah.
And he wanted to train him. But George also said, this was in your book, that he never got the chance to go a 4 or 6 or 8 rounds. He was fighting 15 rounds.
Oh, yeah.
He never got through the learning.
That's right. Yeah. Never fought prelims, never fought undercard. No, always the main event. Yeah. I mean, I think it was his 5th fight they threw him with Howard King. Howard King was, a year before that had been ranked number 5 in the world. So, he never had the chance to develop slowly. And a lot of it was because, he at the time he was involved with, a couple of different managers that were getting on in years and wanted to cash in as quickly as they could. So,
yeah. Same thing happened with Art Hafey with Suey Wells.
Oh, yeah.
And Art was calmly, he was in tears because George had been out in Halifax and he recognized Art.
Yeah.
And it made Art's life.
Yeah.
The big man recognized him.
Yeah.
And like you said, Art, because of Don Shargan, who you knew, the promoter said, Art's only problem was that he was white and he was good and he didn't have a criminal record. Same with Chuvalo. He was white, he was good, but he wasn't bad mouthing people or doing bad.
That's right. Yeah.
In boxing, that almost counts against you.
Exactly. Yeah, and in Art's case, he was the number 1 contender for 4 years. He was the most popular fighter in Los Angeles. Ahead of guys like Bobby Chacon and Bazooka Limon, but never got his shot.
No,
that's one of the real tragedies of Canadian boxing. I think is the way that he was treated.
And he knocked out Ruben Olivares.
Yeah.
And in the second fight, when I was at the Hall of Fame in 2014 or 2013, I walked up to Richard Steele and I said to him, I wanted you to know that I personally didn't vote for you, even though we got in. He said, why? Because you cheated Art Hafey. I said, in the second fight with Olivares, one guy had it 8-6-1 Hafey, the other guy had it 8-6-1 Olivares. You had it 14-1 Olivares.
That's right. Yeah.
And he said, well, that I may have been off. You cheated. You either were paid off, but you did it deliberately, and that counts against you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And people don't know that when he fought Danny Little Red Lopez, Art had Thompson's disease.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Neurological disease, which froze his body.
Yeah, you couldn't bend. Yeah.
Couldn't move. And my father would take me down to Buffalo to visit his cousins who he hadn't seen in 30 years just so we could watch Art Hafey fight
Yeah,
on TV.
yeah.
You know, and he was rated by Ring above David Cote. He was rated above the world champion.
That's right. Yeah.
You know, one of the all-time greats. People should know him. I know Nicky Furlano knows him and other, but it just same as you. I mean, you know, it just kills me that people don't know how great Art Hafey was. And I submitted him for an Order of Canada, and they just said, "Who is he?" And I said, "Oh, you got to be kidding."
Yeah.
You know, we had he doesn't need fundraisers, but I wanted to do a testimonial to him in Halifax, and Peter McKay wouldn't.
Really?
Wouldn't allow it. The McKay family wouldn't allow it because when Art came back from San Diego, a friend said, "Can you appear at a political rally?" And he said, I'm apolitical. I know nothing about politics. I support no one. I have nothing to do with it. I don't care. So he just appeared. He didn't speak. He literally walked in, waved, walked out.
Right.
A Liberal candidate, and they held it against him.
Yeah, jeez, yeah.
And a friend of mine for the Globe, whom you know, Tabitha Suey, wrote an article about that. They said, this is preposterous.
Yeah.
He didn't even know the guy.
Jeez.
And they still held it against him.
Yeah.
How have you been in touch with George's family recently?
Yeah, I communicate with his son Mitch a few times each year, and you know, Mitch is a great guy, and you know, like he said, I mean, you know, the sad thing about dementia is that you know, it's robbed George of, you know, any memories of, you know, basically who he is and what he accomplished, but the silver lining to that is also taken away the horrific memories of, you know, what's happened to his family. Yeah. But he's in a, you know, he's very well cared for. He's in a facility where they just adore him, and he's, you know, he's comfortable. He's happy, and it's you know, it is what it is.
I was told a story. I think Mitch told me this, where before he went in there, he was driving his car. You probably heard this somewhere near London, Ontario, or Hamilton. But he parked on the side of the road. He was wandering, and a police officer stopped. And George said, "Am I in trouble? Am I going to get arrested?" He said, "Mr. Chuvalo, I just want to help you. Do you know where you are?" "No, I don't know where I am."
Yeah.
"You know where you're going?" "No."
Yeah.
"Okay." So he got his son, and Mitch took care of it, and they brought the car back. But this 25-year-old police officer just said, "That's Chuvalo.
Yeah.
You know, I can't allow this. I can't allow him to be hurt."
Right. Yeah.
You know, and this outpouring of love. I mean, he should have his own stamp. He should have George Chuvalo Day here.
Absolutely.
And I mean, when I was a kid, I didn't believe in Superman. And then I grew up and found out George was Superman. And Randy Roberts, I mentioned this to Randy Roberts, which he loved. I had a conversation with George. This goes back to the set of Cinderella Man in 2004. And so we're talking about, and I said, it's incredible that you called him Ali after his name got changed. He said, "You're allowed to change your name." And I said, and also, you supported his stand against the war. And George said to me, "Well, the Vietnam War is based on the obsolete domino theory that," and Randy just shook his head. He said that if one Asian nation falls to communism, they all will. He said that wasn't true. And we knew it wasn't true before the war.
Yeah.
And Randy said, "That's incredible." He said, "There aren't many historians or politicians who would understand the domino.
That's right. Exactly.
The prize fighter from Canada understood it perfectly."
Yeah.
I mean, this is a smart, educated guy.
Oh, you know, and that's, you know, that's one of the things I love about him is, you know, George could talk, you know, intelligently and
on anything.
On, you know, on so many topics on so many levels, whether it was religion, literature, history, you know, pop culture, and it was all, you know, he wasn't just spitting out stuff to hear his own voice. What he had to say was, you know, gold.
I have to tell you, in your book on him, I was at the book signing at Chapters I think it was on the Danforth.
Right.
And so it was packed.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine came, and his daughter was 4 or 5, and she didn't know who George was, but she crawled right on his lap and hugged him.
Yeah.
And anyways, so I got the book, and he wrote, P.S. I know you miss Angelo because Angelo just died, and I know what he means to you. And I read that, and I just started to cry.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a man who went through everything, but he was more concerned with what I was
doing. Yeah. Yeah. That's the way he is. You know, I had in 2009, I had a medical episode where I collapsed and ended up in the ICU with a blood sugar count of 48. So they put me on an insulin pump for 20 hours, and I was actually in a diabetic coma. But when I came to, and they moved me to a private room, a nurse came in the next day, and she had a stack of phone messages, you know, and she said, George Chuvalo has been phoning for you. She said, from the day you were brought in right up until yesterday, he's phoned every day to check on you, and he wants to know when, you know, he wants us to let us know when you'll be ready to talk. And I thought, you know, that's George. And sure enough, you know, because my wife had called him when I first went into the hospital, and he was, every day he was checking up on me, you know, from 2,000 miles away.
Wow.
And that was, you know, that's just the kind of guy he is.
You're a family member. He's got to.
Yeah. And, you know, and, you know, for years and years and years, he would phone my son on his birthday, on my son Dan's birthday. George would phone, you know, from the time he was 6 years old right up until he was, you know, 22, you know, and it didn't matter where he was in the world. He'd call me from Thailand, from India, from Italy, from South Africa, you know, just to make sure everything was okay, you know.
Can you speak a bit to, I know the fact that his best friend, and he loved Ali, but he loved Joe Frazier. I mean, they were exceptionally close.
Yeah.
And he's told me that Frazier, I think you told me Frazier called him every week.
Yeah.
And they loved each other.
Yeah. And Joe, you know, Joe wasn't a guy who, you know, Joe was very, 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 very close with his own family, and you know, loved his fans, but wasn't known for being particularly friendly with opponents, you know, former opponents. But he and George had a very, very strong friendship, and he would check in. You know, George would call him, or Joe would call George. Yeah, a couple of times a month, and Marvis Fraser as well. I've got to be real close with George, and when Joe died, George was really took it hard, because they were very close. Yeah, and you know, considering the, you know, the damage that Joe caused, you know, with that left hook that basically knocked George's eyeball out.
Broke his orbital bone.
Yeah.
And didn't Frazier's mother hit him after the fight?
Yeah.
I thought he was your friend.
Yeah.
But he visited George in the hospital.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think you mentioned in your book how George was out west giving a seminar, anti-drug seminar, and then he got the news and he called Joe and said, just hang on one more night. I'm begging you.
Yeah.
And he got there the next day, but it wasn't.
That's right. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And I know he took the death of Ali very hard too.
Very hard. Yeah.
Well, they shared something. I mean, those men shared an era and a time that'll never exist again. Which leads me to my last question. Will we ever? It's a stupid question. Will we ever see another George Chuvalo anywhere in the world?
No. There. You know, I mean, first of all, you're never going to see 15-round fights again.
Right.
And like George is, fond of saying that, he's the last survivor of the 15-round club, because that was real fighting, that was real boxing. You're never going to see that again. But you'll never see the combination of strength, durability, and just relentless aggression that he brought. I don't
Yeah.
think that, and that's something that's from inside. You can't teach that. And we were lucky enough in Canada and the world to see it through his career. And it just really resonates with me personally, because, like I said, I became a fan when I was 6-7 years old, and here I am 60 years later, and I still worship the guy. So
Me too. And I have to tell you, I mean, because you've been all over the world. When they find out you're from Canada, do you know George Chuvalo?
yeah.
You're the only guy that can say, yeah, actually, he's my brother. I do know him very well.
Yeah.
I know when we were there at the Hall of Fame, I paged you. I don't think you got the page. There was a person there from the States, and he said, you Canadians always say that Chuvalo never got knocked down, but Bonavita knocked him down. I said, Bonavita never knocked him down.
That's right.
He stepped on his foot, and he pushed him, and George never went down. He tripped backwards, but he never hit the canvas.
That's right.
So I said, and I'm going to prove it to you now. Saying that, call Murray, who knows him, and George, and they're going to come over and they're going to tell you, you're going to have to apologize. And I don't think you got the page, but I mean, he beat Bonavita, but Bonavita was an exceptionally dirty fighter.
Oh yeah. Well, that was, in Boxing Illustrated, that it was a front cover story by Leo Lipset, and that was the headline. Chuvalo won the fight. Bonavita got the decision.
Bonavita, Patterson, and Terrell.
Yeah.
And it's like Angelo, instead of Cinderella Man in 204, someone said to him, what was it like when the mob used to run boxing? And he said, what do you mean used to?
Yeah.
He said, they've run it since the 1700s. They still run it today. Mm-hmm. And they always will, and you can't get rid of them.
That's right.
That's right. You said, I asked George, do you regret not hooking up with a mob guy? He said, if I were hooked up with a mob guy, I may have won the title, because I would have had the muscle, but I never would have had any money.
Yeah, exactly.
They would have stolen everything.
Yeah.
Murray, I just want to thank you so much. It's been the privilege and pleasure of my year, my life, to have you on.
My pleasure entirely.
Where can we get your books? Going the Distance, you can still get on Amazon.
Yeah.
And same with the wonderful George Chuvalo book.
That's right. Yeah. They're all still out there. You might have to do a little digging on Amazon or eBay, but they're all still there. Yeah.
Well, I have to say that Yvon Michel, the promoter in Montreal, and all boxing promoters in Canada owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude, and I think a lot of money, because you've kept the sport alive. You single-handedly kept boxing as a viable sport in Canada. You're the one that did it. No one else. You did that.
Well, I appreciate that, Lou. Thanks very much.
And I look forward to the book on McCarty and Pelkey.
Absolutely.
And
Pale Imitation, the short, stormy history of the World Light Heavyweight Championship.
I can't wait. When is that coming out?
2025.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to take care of myself so I can be alive then and get it and read it. The story is fantastic, but it'll be more fantastic when you write it, or when we read what you've written. Thank you so much to our guest, Murray Greig. And please, folks, I beg of you, go online and get the book of George Chuvalo. This is the best boxing biography I've ever read, and I have over 2,000 of them here in my apartment, driving my wife nuts. And Going the Distance. If you want to know the history of Canadian boxing, every great boxer and every boxer going back several hundred years, this is the book you want to get. Murray Greig is the premier boxing writer, premier sports writer ever produced by this country, and one of the best in the world. a world champion in his own right. We thank you for watching our show, Rink Talk, and we will see you again next Sunday. Be well.
Thanks, Lou.
Thank you, Murray. You be well.
You too.